Hello, my name is Robert Bolton and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Institute for Social Science at University College Cork in Ireland. And I co-wrote this article entitled What Can Welfare Stigma Do? With my colleagues Dr. Fiona Dukelow from University College Cork and Dr. Whelan from Trinity College in Dublin. And the aim of the article is essentially a state-of-the-art review on the literature, the qualitative literature on welfare stigma in the Irish and UK contexts. And what we've done is we've separated the article into three parts. We talked about how is welfare stigma experienced by people, how is welfare stigma reproduced on multiple levels, and finally, how is welfare stigma resisted. Our broader aim of the article was to come up with a new way of questioning around welfare stigma, a new approach to thinking and analysing welfare stigma. So at the outset of the state of the art review, we were simply looking at the qualitative literature in the Irish and UK contexts to explore the question of what does welfare stigma do in terms of what is the effects of welfare stigma. And of course, one of the old definitions of welfare stigma is that it's defined as the psychic or psychological effects of being on welfare and the stigma that's associated with being on welfare. So asking the question, what does welfare stigma do, however, it finds those answers, but it finds, it's a question that's very much rooted in the past. It finds those definite set of answers around the effects of welfare stigma. And of course, the answers are almost always negative, of course. Obviously, we do not think that being on welfare, social welfare, and engaging with welfare services should be in any way stigmatized. But when we were conducting the review, we felt that a different question could be asked. And the question was mostly inspired really from our review of the literature around resisting welfare stigma. So instead of asking what does welfare stigma do, we began to ask what can welfare stigma do? So this question leaves us open to interpretations and alternative insights and implications of the effects of welfare stigma. It obviously opens up questions of what are the negative effects of welfare stigma. For example, it can cause a range of negative feelings associated with shame, and it can have social implications for people. They want to try and hide the fact that they are engaging with welfare services, etc., or they want to hide that they are in receipt of social welfare. But the question also enables us to focus on the sort of more positive work that can be done by people and with people in their communities, work that is based on those stigmatizing experiences and those shame-based experiences. Obviously, we're not saying, and we do not feel that welfare stigma is a good thing. It's clearly not. But I guess the question enables us to stop getting stuck with shame, because shame itself is a very isolating emotion and a very demobilizing emotion. So for us, what can welfare stigma do opens up new avenues of thinking about in what ways can the experiences of being stigmatized or feeling a sense of shame and stigma from engaging with welfare services, how can those experiences be mobilized to do a different kind of political work? How can they be put to use politically by people? So one key finding is that welfare stigma can absolutely be resisted, but not merely in terms of preventing welfare stigma in the first place, or preventing the multitude of shame feelings in the first place, but it can be resisted by using those feelings and using those experiences. So to give a brief backdrop, the literature finds that there are a couple of common ways in which people experience welfare stigma. One of them is self-blame. So individuals blame themselves for the social issues which have caused their need to be on welfare payments or to engage in welfare services. So here, obviously, this is the neoliberal model of individualizing social problems, and obviously, the people themselves who feel welfare stigma are not to be blamed for individualizing their issues. But it does deflect attention from the structural genesis of issues themselves. So self-blame is the first one. A second common dynamic is othering. So othering would be defined as demarcating your differences from others in a way that shames other people. And normally what we find in the literature is that people who are on welfare payments can engage in othering, but it's engaging in the othering of socially proximate individuals. So it's people who are in similar circumstances as themselves. Now, the problem with this othering is that it separates people, it breaks the potential for solidarities, and it pits people against each other. This is another aspect of the phenomenological experience of stigma and shame. Stigma and shame are felt to be very isolating experiences, and not only may people other people who are socially proximate to them, but individuals themselves might hide aspects of their identities and from others that may show that they are, for example, living in poverty or facing financial difficulties, or they may also hide the fact that they are engaging in welfare services or in receipt of welfare payments. So those are two aspects of the phenomenological experience of shame and welfare stigma, but they are not inevitable. So we found that when people are able to speak about their stories, speak about their vulnerabilities, speak about their stigma or shame-based stories, something happens, solidarities emerge, and people begin to connect their experiences to the structural genesis of them. So rather than individualizing or self-blaming themselves, people are able to recognize the structural sources of poverty, for example, and also the structural sources of why people feel stigmatized in the first place. We engaged a little bit with the psychosocial literature on the subject, which shows that when people are able to acknowledge their feelings of stigma and shame, they are much more able to build bonds of solidarity with others. So that is a key finding. And what that means is that the experience of shame and the experience of welfare stigma can be used to forge solidarities with others, which may potentially lead to more social or political mobilization that would question the sources of poverty in the first place, and also question the sources of welfare stigma in the first place. So our literature review showed that there are a couple of more questions that need to be asked, and a couple of more questions that need to be answered. And for us, those questions relate to resistance. So there is a literature out there showing the multiple ways in which people resist welfare stigma. However, one question which is lacking is what enables or what moderates people's engagement in different resistance practices. So when it comes to welfare stigma specifically then and its relationship to shame, we do think more research needs to be done on what exactly is the role of shame in moderating resistance practices, because there does seem to be a suggestion in the research that people who are able to talk openly about their vulnerabilities and about their feelings of stigma are more able to generate solidaristic bonds with others, and are also able to link their experiences to structural issues. On the other hand, then, people who repress shame and repress the stigma they experience, there is a suggestion that those people are more likely to engage in the practice of othering. So to sum up, one question could be asked is what enables people to engage in the resistance practices they do, and what is the role of repressed and acknowledged shame and stigma in that. There are very good reasons for the dominant power structure to create a welfare imaginary that stigmatizes those who engage in welfare services or who are in receipt of welfare payments. The welfare stigma is very much associated with othering, which breaks solidarities with others, and self-blame, which individualizes social problems. And this is very consistent with the neoliberal economic model we are currently living in. So there are good reasons to create that environment of shame and stigma around welfare. But we would think that welfare stigma doesn't always have to be seen as a top-down infliction, but it can be a bottom-up resource for social change. So we suggest an approach that conceives how welfare stigma can do a different kind of socio-political work, one that is generative of a new welfare imaginary, and that recognizes mutual vulnerability and solidarity, and that recalls some of the elements of collectivism that underpinned Beveridge's project.